Okay, so we are currently recording this webinar online, and so afterwards I will distribute this webinar to everyone and you can see it again. And there's also links at the end of it for resources, so you'll be able to have those as your notes as well. I'm hoping everyone can see my big red screen. It says manure management on your horse farm in front of you. So real quick, just some housekeeping. You might need to adjust your speaker, your headphone volume to whatever level is comfortable for you. We ask that you hit the mute button. If you need to ask a question, feel free to come off of mute, ask your question, or you can write it in the chat box below as well if you'd like. If you're having any issues with connectivity, you might need to hit the video button and turn your video off if you at any time have it on. That tends to help with the connectivity issues that you have. So tonight, we're going to talk about manure on your farm, kind of the environmental impacts of it, the nutrient that can be lost from your manure from mismanaged manure piles, the disposal of the manure, what to do with it when we have now collected it, and storage options. When I talk about storage options, I'm going to give you a bunch of different ideas, as well as connecting with soil conservation that can possibly help you. So we'll give you a lot of information tonight. And like I said, this is recorded, so you'll be able to see this again later on. So why should we care about manure? We want to care about this is because when we have a lot of manure laying around in our, say our barns, our run-in sheds, we have piles of it outside, you know, after you've then mucked out your stalls, insects and parasites love to use it as a breeding ground. It takes no time for these insects and parasites to breed and reproduce, and their life cycle is quite fast. So we would like to prevent that. There's also some skin diseases that can occur. The horses can develop thrush, white lines disease, so standing in these areas that are wet, damp, and have these species and urine in them. Odors, we don't like the smell of them. And quite frankly, these piles of manure that sometimes we have outside of our barns are quite unsightly. And I am in Baltimore County, but so we have a lot of rural area, but we also have a lot of really nice neighborhoods. And these people don't want to see this overrun farm. So we kind of have to keep that in consideration as well. And then of course, environmental concerns. And that's kind of my main focus is the environmental concerns with the manure that potentially can happen. We're going to talk about nuisances as first. This is kind of sounds a little bit silly, but we really need to pay attention to these nuisances as keeping the manure dry as possible below that 50% moisture. Again, to not have these flies breeding, not have the parasites. You know, we're always trying to find a different way, especially in the summertime. You know, get rid of these flies that are flying around in the barn, kind of probably annoying us. Manure that's allowed to decompose, that just like sits there without any oxygen. It's not being turned. It becomes anaerobic, which is then when it starts really smelling foul, and we have more problems after that. We'd also like to make sure we're keeping these manure piles down away from the stable area, away from your neighbor's house, preferably probably your house as well. But then our really main concern here is water pollution, right? I'm sure you've heard a lot of people at the MDA, the Maryland Department of Agriculture, or MDE, the Department of Environment. We're always watching how can we better our bay? How can we clean it up? Well, one step of that is for us as horse owners to make sure that the manure is not running off, the nutrients within the manure is not running off into the bay, into the creeks out back that are eventually leading onto the bay. So we're not managing them correctly. We have surface water issues. We also have groundwater pollution, right? We don't want this getting into our well water because you're probably, if you're living on a farm, you're probably drinking out of a well. And at the end of the day, we don't want to be polluting our well. So these are things to consider. They call this non-point source pollution. Basically, if you have this pile of manure that's down here on the bottom right-hand side, it's raining, see how it's collected all this water. The next thing you know, it's running off into someone's creek, and it's picking up all these different things along the way that probably are not good for our water sources. So we want to eliminate that. We want to keep everything contained in one area and not moving on to the next. When we talk about nutrient losses, there's several different ways that these nutrients, and when I talk about nutrients, I talk about nitrogen, phosphorus, mainly. There's also potash that can move away, but mainly our main focus is nitrogen and phosphorus. Because when you think about algae blooms in the bay, that's what's contributing to it. It's the nitrogen and the phosphorus. So these nutrients can move from the manure through runoff, leaching. You know, if you have your manure piles just sitting there, it doesn't really have much bedding in it. All that moisture falls out, and then it leaches through the soil, especially if you have it on just a random piece of ground outside of your barn. You don't have a concrete, non-porous surface. It's leaching down through the ground. Volatilization, which is conversion of it would be nitrogen and it turns into a vapor and it goes up into the atmosphere. We also kind of face denitrification, which is the process of converting the nitrate gas to nitrogen gas, and then it becomes up into the atmosphere as well. So what we want is nitrification. That's where it's taking that nitrogen, turning it into nitrate, which is a plant available nutrient for whatever crop is in the ground, for the grass, for your pastures, or whether you are spreading this onto crop ground. So like I said, when I'm talking about nutrients, I'm talking about nitrogen and phosphorus typically. Nitrogen is our number one key player here because nitrogen moves so readily. It easily leaches through the ground. It easily volatilizes up into the air. It likes to move. It doesn't like to stay put in one spot. When horses are urinating, they excrete urea, which is converted to ammonia. Ammonia is easily volatilized and goes up into the atmosphere. So if you are not bedding down on like a heavy absorbent material, that is more likely to occur. When nitrate, which is the plant available form of nitrogen, becomes in contact with these surface waters, it then leads to algae blooms. I'm sorry, the ammonia, when it gets into surface waters, it then leads to algae blooms as well. I'm not saying that our horse manure is the sole reason of algae blooms by any stretch. There's a lot of different sources, but we don't want to be part of that source. And then when we have excessive algae plus the ammonia, which then converts into nitrate, it depletes the oxygen in the water. So that's when we have these fish kills. It's not as common up here as it used to be. We've definitely have gotten better with farmers not overly applying fertilizer, commercial fertilizer or manure. And we've been really cleaning up the bay, but we don't want to be part of that problem. What we want to happen is that we want the ammonia converting to the nitrate and it's actually being taken up by the plant. So when we apply it to the ground, we want that plant to take up exactly what it needs. We don't want any excessive nitrogen moving on. Phosphorus. Phosphorus doesn't leach easily through the soil. It likes to stay put. It's not very active. But what can happen with phosphorus is that it can run off through erosion, or say that you are applying your manure to the ground when it's middle of winter, which is not supposed to happen anyway. But say that you're applying during the middle of winter, ground is rock hard, it's not going to actually absorb into the ground. It's just going to keep on going, and we'll end up eventually into the water source. So we've talked about the nutrients in manure, but now we need to know how much manure is being produced. And I kind of find this a little bit shocking, that horses are typically per day are producing 51 pounds of manure. Now that is calculated with feces, so 30 pounds of that and about 2.5 gallons of urine a day. So that's a lot of manure. That doesn't even include bedding, right? So if you were to have your horse inside, and now these stats are pretty much a horse inside 24/7, which I know most of us do not have our horses in that long. But there is the possibility of them creating up to 60 to 70 pounds of stall waste a day. So that's about 10 pounds of bedding plus your 50 pounds of manure. So that's a significant number when you think about it. It's obviously going to vary. You might only use a little bit of bedding. You might only keep your horse in an hour a day. So this is definitely something to take into consideration when you are thinking about different storage units that you'd like to use, how much manure that your horses are actually going to be producing. And I'm sure you've heard this all before, that horse manure is a good soil amendment. It's not as good as what we would like for poultry if we were going to be using this on row crops and we needed a lot of nitrogen, a lot of phosphorus, but it's not a bad soil amendment. But the key is to having a good soil amendment here is that we're going to make sure that this does not change in any way. So then we'll talk about that in a little bit. So basically these numbers say here, the pounds per ton. So you can see here on the bottom, I have the horses, this 23 pounds of nitrogen per ton, okay? So this means that it's not a percentage. So the nitrogen content of 23 pounds per 2,000 pounds of manure is what this is saying. Now, when you see a commercial bag of fertilizer, say that the number said 23 on there, said 23, 10, 10, right? That is the percentage. So 23% of nitrogen is in that 50-pound bag. So say you had a ton, which is 2,000 pounds of fertilizer, that would be 460 pounds of nitrogen in a ton of fertilizer. So just a little bit of math. This isn't the direct number. It's 23 pounds of nitrogen per ton. Now, I do always say, though, if you're going to be using this as a soil amendment, you want to make sure that you're always testing your manure before you put it in onto your ground or in your gardens or wherever you're putting it, so you know exactly what you have. And I can always get you in contact with the labs that will look at your manure, give you a report, and then you can know what you actually have. So manure as a soil amendment, it contains soluble and insoluble organic compounds. Like I said, it varies a lot. It varies on the type of bedding that you have. The woodier the bedding material is, the higher the carbon ratio is going to be. It depends on the age of the manure, types of feed that you're feeding your horse. Are you feeding them too much and are excreting it out? Are you feeding a lot of supplements that maybe they don't actually utilize, their body's not utilizing all of them, so they're excreting a lot of it out? And then how is the manure stored? Is it just sitting in a pile and the rain's coming down on and it's a lot of the nutrients are being moved on? Or is it in a contained area with a roof on it? I just put this table in here because I wanted to show a little bit the different carbon to nitrogen ratios for various materials. So this is we'll talk about composting because we really would like people to compost their manure. But this gives you an idea of horse manure without bedding is a 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. And that's the most ideal ratio, really. The more woody the material is, like the sawdust, it's 500-to-1. Shavings is 846 to 1. That's really heavy, high carbon material. But if you have a lot of grass hay mixed in with it, it's going to come down a bit because that's higher in nitrogen material. So when you think of something that's green, it's going to be high in nitrogen. Something more brown, it's going to be higher in carbon. And that's kind of why I put the brown versus green here, just kind of as a visual for you. So you have this manure. Now what are you going to do with it? So we're going to talk about storage, composting, land applying it. And if you're land applying it, we're going to need to talk about the nutrient management regulations. So we have manure storage. We're always going to be looking at manure storage, kind of better ways to store manure. I put a bunch of different ideas up here. The one is the concrete pads, very non-porous material. It probably has a slope on there so that all the water that's collected stays in there. The downfall with this is that you do still have the rain. That's going to be rain, snow, sleet. It's going to be changing the composition of your manure pile. My favorite is probably this covered one with the red roof and the gates. Safety, putting the manure in there. It has a door on the back so that the people can come in and pick it up, or if you're using it as compost, you can get in there easily to rotate it. It's a very easy structure. We also have a roll of dumpsters, which are totally fine. They have become pretty popular. If you're using straw bedding, there's a lot of guys that come out and will pick it up for a very small charge, sometimes even free because it's going to a mushroom composting facility anyway. Some of them, if you're using more like sawdust and shavings, you're probably gonna have to pay to have it removed, but it's an idea as well. And this one down on the bottom, I still like as well. It's an easy spot. They're covering it, so the rainwater's not getting to it. Nutrients aren't running off. It's easy. The flies aren't trying to lay in there and have a breeding ground either. So it's easy and it's doable. When you're thinking about a storage site, I want you to think about kind of a higher ground where the water's not laying. It's easily accessible to any trucks or tractors that need to get in there and remove it. I put this minimum separation distances from different areas in here. There's nothing actually set in stone. We're trying to work better on regulations, but this is what we really try to tell everybody, that we want these storage areas 100 feet away from a property line, 200 feet away from anybody's house, your neighbor's house. Definitely 200 feet away from any wells, wetlands, surface waters. So the further away from the water sources, anyone's property line, the better. It just makes things easier for your neighbors, for yourself, and you're not contaminating any water source. When you think about size, I would like to typically tell people to have storage for 90 days. I know that's not really always going to happen, but here in Maryland, we are not allowed to spread manure from December 15th to March 1st of the following year. So it's those winter months, we cannot spread manure. Now, if you're having the manure taken away, then you can kind of make it smaller, because you have to worry about holding the manure, stacking it somewhere. But you should keep it big enough that if you got into a pinch, you wouldn't be just having to put it somewhere else. I can stay in one spot. So consider also slope entrance ramps, so that the surface water stays out of the manure. There's also nothing coming out of the manure holding area as well. There is potential cost share for these structures. You'll just have to contact your local soil conservation district. If you need help finding them, feel free to contact me and I can help you locate who is your soil conservation district manager. They just require, so they have something called Max cost share program each year, and you have to sign up for it. These structures can be built, but they have to be on the farm where the waste is being generated. You can't have it on someone else's, like your neighbors. It has to be on your place. To receive the full cost share, which is up to 87.5%, you need at least 15 animal units, which an animal unit is 1,000 pounds, so typical size horse. You'll need 15, but if you have between 8 and 14, you can still get some cost share. You just wouldn't get the full amount, and they have a prorated amount for each animal unit that they can walk you through. But these are two examples of structures that they can build. They can build something very nice with a roof on it, or it could just be a simple cinder block concrete pad that is pretty simple and straightforward. All right, so we're going to talk about composting, a little switching gears, composting manure. We're really pressing folks to start composting your manure. It's beneficial to you. It's beneficial back to the environment as well. It can reduce the volume of your manure by 50%, which is awesome. It minimizes pathogens, odors, insect problems because it's heating up to a certain temperature that are generated by these microbes. It also destroys any weed seeds that are coming in from your hay, the straw. So we don't want to spread any more noxious weeds than we already have here. And it also stabilizes the nitrogen and phosphorus. So then if you go to land apply it or put it in your garden, it's actually going to be plant readily available. But there's 4 ingredients that you'll need to have a good compost mixture. You're going to need the carbon materials, like I said, the browns, the nitrogen materials, water, and then air. So these compost materials, they have to have some moisture in them. If it's too wet, then you're going to get that funky smell. If it's too dry, it's not going to actually compost. It's going to take longer to compost. And it's same way with the carbon to nitrogen ratio. We want that to stay pretty level around 30 to 1, because that is like the best way. The microbes are going to do what they need to do while it's also composting at the appropriate rate. And we want it to stay between 120 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit for the microbial action to take place. So that's why you're going to have to turn these systems. You turn them, they reach the temperature that you want, you turn it and you let it come back up to reach it again. And you do it several times until it's really composted and broken down. So there's 2 common methods that we use in this area. Windrowing, which you can see the top right-hand corner there, is a windrowing method. Windrowing is really good for these big operations. If you have a lot of horses, it's easier for that. There's a machine that can go over it and turn it, or you can use your tractor to turn your pile as well. So just remember that composting is an aerobic process, so it needs oxygen. If it's not, it becomes anaerobic, and that's when we aren't actually composting anything. So just remember, composting all about turning it, making sure that it has the good airflow. We also see these aerated systems, which are good for smaller farms. So basically, they have these PVC pipes that can have forced air, which you can see on the bottom right-hand corner. They have a blower, so they're blowing air in. So they never really have to turn this pile. They might have to kind of do a little bit of turning, get the stuff that's on the top to maybe the middle, but it has forced air in there. Or you can also do on the bottom left-hand side. This is also a different way of aerated system. It's a PVC pipe with tiny little holes in it, and it kind of just passively has the airflow in there. So managing these piles is pretty crucial to make sure you have the most ideal compost coming out of it. You want to make sure that it stays between 50 to 60% moisture-wise. And basically, you know that by, if you can squeeze it and it's kind of like a sponge, that's appropriate. If it's like just running out of your hand when you pick it up, that's too wet. If it's just kind of crumbly, it's way too dry. This water provides an environment for the microbes to do what they like doing best, to breaking down that bacteria. When we're turning it, the more that we're turning it, the faster it's going to compost for you. So just keep that in mind, depending on how fast you need this compost, or if you're okay with it sitting for a while. The temperatures, like I said, you want to keep that 130, 140 range. It can get up as high as 160, but these high temperatures kill any pathogens or weed seeds. They don't, you don't want it too high because then the microbes will die. And if it's too low, they're not actually going to be doing their job as well. So it also, just a reminder, timing, it's all in how fast you need this, right? Do you want it tomorrow, or is it okay to sit around for a couple of weeks? So it varies. And it also varies with the carbon to nitrogen ratio. The higher the carbon that's in there, the slower it's going to take to compost. And it's also good to remember that nitrogen can be lost when there's too much in there. So if the carbon nitrogen ratio is low, if it's like 20 to 1, 10 to 1, it means there's a lot of nitrogen there. It might start volatilizing any of that ammonia. But then if you get it too high, the nitrogen is immobilized and it slows down that process, like I was saying. So some of you might not have your horses in all the time, so you're not collecting a lot of manure with a lot of bedding, but there are still manure out in the pastures that you can pick up and collect, especially around the gate areas, the run-in sheds they're standing in all the time. A good idea after collecting whatever you can is to harrow and break up the manure. It spreads it out evenly across the pastures that you have. Right now, in the spring, maybe not when it's raining, but it would be perfect time to harrow your fields. I also like to do it kind of in the middle of the summer because any parasitic eggs that are in the fecal count, you can break that up. The hot sun kills them. So that's another way to help with keeping the parasite levels low in your operation. So you have all this manure, you have all this compost. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to apply it to your pastures and your hay fields? Are you going to sell it to the gardeners or landscapers? I know it's a hot commodity to, especially the gardeners. We have a lot of master gardeners that come through my building and they're always asking, where can they get that? Especially if it's composted appropriately. They love it. Or you can also haul it off your premises. But I just want to kind of remind everybody that whatever you're doing with it, make sure that you are keeping good records. MDA comes around, they're going to want to see your records. They're wanting to see where it's going, how much is being applied to your fields. That's kind of the gist of the compost talk. I want to touch base on nutrient management because if you're land applying your manure, you need to take in consideration about the Maryland nutrient management rules. You'll need a nutrient management plan if your operation grosses more than $2,500 a year and or you have 8 or more animals. So you'll need a nutrient management plan. And it doesn't take much. If you board 2 horses, you can easily exceed the $2,500. So you're going to need a nutrient management plan, regardless if you're land applying or not. You'll definitely need a plan. Basically, this plan just says, it gives you recommendations of what type of, or where to put the product, your fertilizer, your manure, the time, right place, right rate. So it's basically recommendations of how to care for your pastures. Who develops these plans? We can, at University of Maryland, we actually have a free program. So if you ever needed one, you call your local extension agent or the office and say that you need a plan done, and they can write a free plan. It's part of your tax dollars here. They are funded through Maryland Department of Agriculture. Or you can also contact a private consultant. This on MDA's website, they have a list of private consultants as well. You'll need soil samples for these plans. basically a stool sample from every field that you have. You'll need to take one every 3 years. They are good for 3 years. If you're spreading manure, you're going to need a manure sample. If you have, they're good for 1 year. If you're not spreading any manure, it's just being exported, you're going to need to know who's exporting it, their address, and a phone number for them. You'll need property tax IDs, property maps. Don't worry too much about the tax IDs because the nutrient management consultants can help you with that. But the best thing is to come in with a map so you know what fields are where, and they can find the tax ID numbers. And then they'll make you a pretty map like this. You'll need to know what crops you're growing. If you're just having pasture, you're going to come in and say, I have some probably tall fescue, orchard grass pastures. If you are doing hay, you'll need to know that as well. Animals, you'll need to know, and I'm sure you do, your total number of horses that you have. You're using bedding, how much bedding, and it's just a guesstimate on how much bedding. It doesn't need to be all written in stone by any means. You also want to give them your turnout schedule, where you're storing the manure, if you're transporting it, how much you're applying to the ground, all the kind of nitty gritty details. So if MDA was to come out to your farm, they know exactly how you operate with fertilizing your fields. It's a good thing to remember that there are application setbacks. So if you're spreading any of these, your manure, it needs to be 35 foot from any waterway. So 35 feet from any part of the water, and it must have a vegetative source growing. So it must be grass. It cannot be put on just some random sacrifice lot. It needs to have actually grass growing. Like I said earlier, the timing of the application of the manure compost is pretty critical. Manure and commercial fertilizer can only be applied through March 1st to December 15th. That winter window, they have to stack the manure. If you have stackable manure, it has to stay somewhere. Only people that can get emergency provisions are basically the dairy and swine guys if their pit was overrun and they had an issue. But typically it has to stay put, so it's not being land applied. And the voucher training. So it's kind of getting towards the end. The voucher training, if you are land applying your manure to 10 or more acres, you'll need to have something called a nutrient management voucher. You can take an online or in-person class. I put up one of our upcoming online courses. It just basically says that, you'll learn how to calibrate your manure spreader, the nutrient management regulations. We only have to do this every 3 years, but MDA wants to make sure you're kind of abiding by all their rules. So it's a quick 2-hour class that you could take online, or you also have in-person sessions at local extension offices. So with that, I just want to say that really we want to focus on proper management of your manure piles. So we are protecting the environment, increasing your efficiency on the farm, and it also can save you fertilizer costs, right? If you're applying this to the ground, there's nutrients there. You don't have to go out and buy fertilizer. As we all know, fertilizer is getting outrageous, just with things going on in the world. So save yourself the money, compost your manure, keep care of it, and apply it to your ground. And also always keep those good records. So if anyone ever questions you, you have something to back it up as well. So that concludes this session for this evening. We have 2 more sessions coming up. April 20th, we're going to have making the end of life decision. And then May 4th, we have Dr. Magda Stewart coming, and she's going to talk about understanding pissing spine for you. So that if anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to talk to you about them. Also, there are some resources that are really good to look over. Like I said, this will be recorded, so you'll be able to have this as long as you like. And if you would be so inclined, we have to have teaching evaluations. So if you could possibly do a teaching evaluation, that would be awesome. If not, it's okay as well. So yeah, I can take any questions if you have any. Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for everybody for attending this evening, and I hopefully see you for our next one on the 20th.